This is my good friend Joel Whitmire.
Howdy.
He's been gracious enough to assist me in completing the final project for History 7001 Global Imperialism. So thanks a lot, Joel, for being here. Thanks for helping me with this.
Yeah,
And
happy to help, bud.
he's providing all the equipment for this. So I literally could not have done it without you. So
Yes, well, I'm providing the equipment from the graciousness of others as well. So, yeah.
it just keeps passing down.
It
The
does.
blessing keeps going. So good deal. Well, let's get into it.
Yeah.
So what we're going to be talking about today is essentially Roman religious laws. So
Okay.
we're going to look at this concept of empire through the lens of religion, and specifically the Roman Empire and how they dealt with religion.
Okay.
So I want to start off here with this quote. This is from Jane Burbank and Frederick Cooper in their book, Empires in World History, Power and Politics of Difference. And this quote says, "Empires are large political units, expansionist or with a memory of power extended over space, polities that maintain distinction and hierarchy as they incorporate new people. The empire reaches outward and draws, usually coercively, peoples whose difference is made explicit under its rule, under the empire's rule. The concept of empire presumes that different peoples within the polity will be governed differently."
Okay.
So what that outlines is this concept that inherently in empire as a form of government, different people groups are inherently going to be governed differently.
Okay.
While there may be sort of one homogenous sort of center group of people, if you will, there's by design and just by necessity, there's going to be diverse people groups because
Right.
of just geography.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I really like that quote a lot. I think the way that it outlines that concept of empire is really good. And so I kind of want to use that as our lens today to talk about the way in which the Roman Empire dealt with different groups.
Okay.
And specifically, I want to seek to answer the question, how did the Roman Empire treat different religious groups?
Okay. Gotcha. So, with that being said, like, how did religion work in the Roman Empire? Like,
Yeah.
what was it?
Mhm.
Because I've heard a lot of different things about it. So, how did
Right.
it work?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think it's helpful to before you get in and understand the way in which the Roman Empire treated different religions, you have to first know, okay, what was their religion? How did it affect their worldview? How did it affect the way that they thought and approached different policy issues? So just kind of on the base level, they had what a lot of people have termed an animistic religion, and that the base definition of that, according to Britannica, is the belief in innumerable spiritual beings concerned with human affairs and capable of helping or harming human interest. And so more specifically than that, Roman religion dictated that all elements of nature, in fact, such as rivers, forests, the sun, all had a literal spiritual element to them and a spiritual being behind them.
Interesting.
So we'll kind of get into a source down here that talks about this in more detail, but they literally believed, like, if you were plowing a field and you're going to, farm that land, there was a process in which you had to give a offering to propitiate the spirit that, funny enough, the way it's actually worded is may or may not be in that field.
Really?
That's the
That's
thing that I
funny.
love about it, is
Yeah.
they basically sort of outline this, like, just in case there's a spirit here that you're disturbing, you ought to give, a sacrifice to propitiate that.
Gotcha.
So that's kind of the basics of that. And then, so we're going to get into this source here. This is, I believe, Seneca talking about these processes of how sort of their understanding of the world, this animistic religion. So he says, and quote, "We venerate the sources of great rivers. We build altars where large streams of water suddenly burst forth from hidden regions. We worship hot springs, and we consecrate certain lakes because of their darkness or depth." And so again, that just kind of adds this, just shows this, even things such as like rivers, they believe that there's a river god or a river goddess that belongs to that river, that has a name. specifically in Rome, the river Tiber runs around the city.
Right.
They believe that the Tiber has a spirit called the Tiber that they pray to on several occasions.
Gotcha.
For, blessing, protection, all of these sorts of things.
Okay.
They also believed, along with the animism, that the worship of their gods, their pantheon, so the kind of larger pantheon of the well-known ones, Jupiter and things like that, and the animistic gods of nature and things like that, was the reason for their abundant success. So as Rome grows from this small, village-like state on the river Tiber and expands out to where they have control of literally most of what we would consider modern-day Europe.
Okay, yeah.
They attribute that to their worship and veneration of the gods.
Interesting, okay.
That's what they believe their source is for what they call the Pax Romana, which is the Roman peace, the peace of the gods.
Right, okay. Well, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
So then we're going to read another little quote here. This is a poem from the poet Horace. He says, "You rule an empire because you acknowledge that you are subordinate to the gods. From them comes every beginning, attribute to them also every outcome. You neglected the gods, and they heaped on Italy many grievous claims."
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that just kind of, again, shows this idea, this thinking, right, that they had about, quite literally, the reason why Rome is successful is because of their worship, their willingness to subordinate themselves to their gods. And this will become a major factor in what we're going to talk about later in the podcast when they dealing with other religions, is that this kind of thinking, this idea that like, hey, we are blessed by the gods because we are faithful to them and worship them,
right,
really affects the way that they treat people that want to worship other religions or want to kind of step out of those bounds.
Naturally, yeah. Yeah.
So then, in addition to that, it's important to remember that Roman religion, which we've kind of touched on a little bit, it's completely a state religion. So unlike a lot of modern cities or nation states and things like that, ancient Rome, the Roman Empire, was fully integrated. Roman religion and the state are one and the same. So much so that they even have a position, the Pontifex Maximus, which is the chief priest of all Roman religion, in charge of all the Roman religious festivals, everything like that, is actually an appointed government position.
Wow, okay.
And even like Julius Caesar holds that post at one point.
Okay.
And then it eventually, if I remember correctly, even becomes, it's just like, commonplace that whoever is emperor gets the title Pontifex Maximus.
Yeah, I was going to say, didn't Emperor Constantine hold that? I thought I heard that. Yeah, cool.
Exactly.
So that is that talking about it being a state religion and talking about it being like having the official, like, how do you say it, Pontifex Maximus, having that as an appointed position, all that.
Yeah.
I think I remember hearing something about the Roman emperors, weren't they deified or something like that?
So, yes, most of the emperors, at least initially, they're actually deified after their death.
Okay.
So it was really commonplace, after one of them dies, like Augustus dies, they change his name to the Divine Augustus.
Okay.
And so it's sort of adds them into this, pantheon to be worshipped, so to speak. But what's fascinating is that wasn't always the case, because you have, in the instance of the Emperor Tiberius,
right,
who's Augustus's predecessor, he follows Augustus. They actually wanted to worship him while he was still alive.
Wow.
So they wanted to build statues in the temples for him to be worshipped, and he denied every request for them to do so. So it wasn't until after he was dead that they then deified him. And now, which is just really fascinating.
He wasn't the first one. You said Augustus.
No, Augustus is the first emperor, technically. He's the first one who officially holds the position of princeps senatus, which just means first man of the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's given the power of imperium over all of the regions of Rome.
Gotcha.
Which then, in effect, turns him into an emperor.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And then Tiberius is the first one to inherit the same titles that Augustus got.
Gotcha. Okay.
And that's sort of what sets the precedent of like, this is a thing now. Like
yeah.
everyone who comes after will get those same titles.
Okay.
But yeah, so that's that with as far as them being deified.
Mm-hmm.
Now that we talked about Roman religion, what it was, animistic faith, pantheon of gods. Now let's get into sort of the way that they treated other religions.
Yeah.
We can start with the way that they treated sort of Eastern religions, mystic, mystery cults,
Mm-hmm.
and just sort of other faiths that occupied the Mediterranean world.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So basics of that, 101, that the Romans in general did not see gods of other people groups as an inherently a threat to them.
Okay.
In fact, they often adopted those gods or would pay homage to them depending on the situation.
Okay.
So I want to read
Interesting.
here another quote. This is from Mycenius Felix, and he writes, "The Romans worship all the gods in the world. Their power and authority have occupied the farthest limits of the whole world, and after they have captured a town, the Romans pay honor to the deities of the conquered people. And thus, while the Romans were adopting the religious rites of all nations, they also won for themselves an empire." So once again, we have this concept where the Romans begin to believe that it is their worship of gods and respect for who all they include as all of the gods that exist
Mm-hmm.
is what gives them their success.
Yeah, it's like it
the
just
thing
keeps
that
reinforcing.
right, it just keeps reinforcing. Like
Mhm.
that is how they won for themselves an empire. And there's good reason for that in the instance that like there's a reason why some of the regions that they annex, right, when they take
Mhm.
over Spain, when they take over Gaul, when they take over Greece, not all of these places have significant revolt movements like you see in other areas of the empire and later on and things like that.
Okay.
Greece to a point becomes fully integrated into the empire.
Right.
And you can understand the logic of that is like the Greek people are allowed to continue to worship their gods
Mm-hmm.
to a point, allowed to live very similar lives to what they did before. And so there's good reason like that historians have pointed out, like one of the ways that why Rome was so successful, kind of agreeing with this sentiment, is that they were able to integrate people of different religions to, at least to a point, which I think is fascinating.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So, and then just that was one of the most probably common reactions to when they encounter gods of other people or other people groups was, and this is very common throughout the Mediterranean world. The Greeks did the same thing. The Egyptians did the same thing to a certain extent. But they would just equate the gods that they encountered of these people groups with their own gods. So if they didn't think it was a new god, they would say, oh, they worship this thing that they call X, but we know it to be this. For example, Tacitus, he has a really famous work called On Germania and the Germanic tribes. And one of the gods that they're worshiping, he essentially says, we know him as Heracles.
Gotcha.
And this is also sort of tied into even their understanding of the Greek gods, the Romans. A big reason why the Greeks have such a like high standing in the peoples that they conquer is because they believe that they worship the same gods. They're like, your pantheon is the same as ours.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So a minute ago, you mentioned mystery cults. Like, what is that? Because I don't think I've ever heard of that kind of thing. Yeah. Well, it sounds, I mean, we have an idea of a cult today. And it's like, ugh.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like foreboding.
Exactly.
Essentially, not to go too much into like the idea of why they're called mystery cults, but what those become understood as from the Roman perspective is specific sects of religious people who will follow one specific god, right? Like it's very common, while you may worship in theory that a pantheon of gods, that you have one that you belong to, right? Or like, so there's like in Greek, there's like the cult of Dionysus, right? Like there's a group of people that follow him, cult of Apollo, right? Like those sorts of things. Same's true in Rome. But there are at least two major ones that start to spring up in popularity within Roman society that cause a bit of concern amongst Roman elites.
Yeah.
And the first one is the worship of a Greek god, Bacchus, and then the second is of a Greek goddess, Isis.
Okay.
And not to get too far into kind of the details of the specifics of those, but in the example of Bacchus, what was actually happening is you would have Roman people who are building shrines and dedications to Bacchus within their own homes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So they're sort of like going above and beyond to venerate this one specific god. And in the Romans' eyes, by doing so, neglect the others.
Gotcha.
In the case of Isis, it's really sort of prominent, is the idea of there's actually this component in followers of Isis where you have this sort of like intimate relationship with Isis. Like that Isis knows you, cares about you, loves you, you can interact with them, these kinds of things.
Interesting.
And that feels very foreign to the Romans and sort of their understanding of the gods up until this point.
Okay. So not to like throw you off there, but
yeah. No, you're good.
Like the Roman religion wasn't so much personal as it was just some rites and some traditions and transactions, and that was it. Like there was no personal interaction kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously like that varies between person to person.
Sure.
There's like some people that they're very into the idea of the gods. They're very, it's like they respect it. They truly are worshiping in a sense. But actually, Dr. Prue at UNG, he's described it before as like gods in the ancient world, particularly those in the Greco-Roman world, are like stocks.
Oh, wow.
In today. And so you buy into one that you think is going to give you the best returns on your investment. It's kind of a crude way of looking at it, but
I mean,
it makes sense because you could venerate one god, and if that god's not doing it for you, like your family is still going through a lot of hardships, you can switch to giving more attention to another god.
Interesting.
There's actually this is just off the top of my head, but it's like I might be in the play Bacchus. Don't quote me on this source, but the play opens and it's talking about how one of the gods is being worshipped a lot, and Aphrodite gets jealous.
Okay.
And so there's definitely that component of like there's some competition between the gods. That part is not unusual, but what's happening with Bacchus and Isis is that level of veneration and love and affinity is going above a point where it hasn't before. To the point that the Romans are saying this is threatening the normal understanding of like what is culturally normal,
which would in turn threaten Pax Romana.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
exactly.
That makes sense.
So, to kind of conclude our thoughts on the Roman religion as a whole, the Roman vision of religion or the worship of deities was not unlike their other contemporaries globally, such as Greece or Egypt. In their eyes, it was entirely plausible that the gods worshipped by other groups of people were in fact real and even worthy of worship in certain circumstances. But what ultimately mattered to Roman officials, to the emperor, to the government, the military, was if the worship of a god or gods threatened the authority of Rome or what they considered to be common cultural decency.
Yeah.
Particularly that second part. It's going to become very important as we get into kind of our next topics and religions that we get into.
Yeah. And so, what you just shared, I knew nothing about. And you know why, but it's interesting and it helps paint the picture. But going from that, I think you had mentioned in here that you wanted to talk about Judaism and
Yeah.
how the Romans treated Judaism, because they're a monotheistic religion versus these pantheistic,
Yes.
if that's the right verbiage.
Yeah, pantheistic would be one.
Okay.
Animistic, pantheistic.
Okay, cool.
It's funny that you say monotheistic. Interestingly enough, the conclusion that the Romans come to about the Jews and the Christians is that they're actually atheistic,
You see, I've
which
heard
is
that
a really
before.
fascinating
It is
thing
interesting.
because we would never think about that today, right?
Yeah,
You wouldn't think
yeah.
of Judaism or Christianity as or as atheistic. That's the opposite of that, right?
Right.
Like we're, Christians and Jews are like, they believe in God, other people are atheists.
Right.
The reasoning, the logic behind that is because you deny the existence of all of the gods but one,
Mm-hmm.
you don't believe in any gods. You believe in
Interesting.
nothing.
Gotcha.
So really fascinating rationale.
Yeah, especially coming after they're upset about those mystery cults,
Mhm.
and then they get hit with this.
Yep.
I'm sure it's quite confusing.
It is, exactly. So that's a good way to think about it. So talking about Judaism
Mhm.
specifically,
Mhm.
what's very interesting is that in general, particularly in earlier years, like under Augustus, kind of the first burgeoning stages of the empire, Judaism received a general amount of tolerance under most of the emperors.
Mm-hmm.
Mainly, the reasoning behind that is because Judaism in that time especially didn't actively seek to convert people.
Right.
Right, like the general kind of rule, as I understand it in Judaism, is that you can convert, but it's mostly from you coming in and choosing to convert.
Yeah,
Right?
you see
the
something
impetus
over
is
here.
put on
Yeah.
you that you want to join the community, and then there's steps you have to go through to do that,
Mhm.
quite rigorous steps.
Mhm.
Whereas they are not, as we'll see when we get to Christianity, actively trying to spread the message of Judaism to each and every person that they see in that same way.
Yeah, I
And
got you.
so that, it kind of creates this relationship where the Romans are like, yeah, like you can, since you're just worshiping your God, like you're allowed to do what you want and just kind of leave us alone.
Pay your taxes, leave us alone.
Yep. And
Yep.
even in fact, we have instances where Augustus in particular, there's a source that reports that he really treated Jews well, particularly in Rome. There's a group of
Mhm.
Jews who make it to Rome as slaves and then earn their freedom, are manumitted. And then Augustus would make sure that if they were going to receive their rations of grain from the city, if it fell on Shabbat, so on Sabbath, he would have the officials wait and bring them their grain the following day,
Interesting.
kind of out of respect for that. So at first, there is this genuine kind of like peace or like at least coexistence
Mm-hmm.
between Judaism and Rome. Obviously, we know in the province of Judea, on the ground from the sources that we have, that there was tensions between the Romans that were there governing the region and the Jews that were there. In all of the kind of New Testament Gospels, you get that picture that there's tension on the ground. You have groups like the Zealots that
Yeah,
are
I was about to
actively
mention
trying
them,
to
yeah.
resist Roman rule. But as like a concept, as a religion, you're permitted the right to be able to practice Judaism under
Gotcha.
Roman law,
Okay.
at least at first.
Yeah.
So that peace between the Jews and Romans doesn't fully persist because between 66 and 135 AD, Rome waged a conflict in the province of Judea, which led to the full destruction of Jerusalem as a city, in effect, and the Jewish temple in 70 AD.
Right.
We're not going to get too much into kind of the reasons behind why all that happened, but the tensions that we mentioned earlier with the Zealots and like things like that, the 1,000-foot view summary is that they kind of come to a head. Eventually gets to the point where the Romans, like Rome, feels like we have to actually go and like end this tension that we've had back and forth.
And they send Titus.
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Roman general.
Yep.
I know that part.
Yep. You're like, I got this trivia.
Yeah.
He's not emperor yet when he goes.
Right. I did know
but
that
his
too.
father goes, he goes, and his brother goes,
Okay.
and then they all end up becoming emperors.
Interesting.
So we're going to read a pretty big chunk here from Josephus, this main source that we have on the sacking of the Jewish temple. I'll try to get through it relatively quickly, but I think it's important to just kind of get this whole picture here.
Yeah.
So describing the event, he says, these Romans put the Jews to flight and proceeded as far as the holy house, the temple itself, at which time one of the soldiers, without staying for any orders and without any concern or dread upon him at so great an undertaking, and being hurried on by a certain divine fury, snatched somewhat out of the materials that were on fire, and being lifted up by another soldier, he set fire to a golden window, through which I don't think that word popped up correctly. Sorry about that. So passage to the rooms that were round about the holy house on the north side of it. As the flames went upward, the Jews made a great clamor, such as so mighty an affliction required, and ran together to prevent it. And now they spared not their lives any longer, nor suffered anything to restrain their force, since that holy house was perishing. Thus it was the holy house burnt down. Nor can one imagine anything greater or more terrible than this noise, for there was at once a shout of the Roman legions, who were marching all together, and a sad clamor of the seditious, who were now surrounded with fire and sword. The people, under a great consternation, made sad moans at the calamity they were under, yet was the misery itself more terrible than the disorder, for no one would have thought that the hill itself, on which the temple stood, was seething hot, as full of fire on every part of it.
Wow. It's talk about tragic.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think just beautifully written by Josephus, captivating imagery. But, he paints this picture of this total destruction, right? That the Romans are coming into the city, not just there to kind of put down an uprising, but they're like, we're going to, wipe the temple out. We're going to just tear this place down.
Right.
So to kind of end this threat. And so what I do think is important, just kind of as a qualifier to what we've just said, while they had this full intent to kind of go in there and end this conflict that they had with the Jewish people. As far as the evidence shows, in my opinion, I think it's important to remember that the Romans were willing to treat other religious groups in the same way that they treat the Jews here. So while they are attacking the Jewish epicenter of worship, they were also kind of did a similar thing in the instance of Carthage, where they were willing to kind of go in and like literally just wipe the city off the face of the earth.
Right.
And so it just kind of, I think, demonstrates that the extent to which they're willing to go to deal with these perceived, religious, anything that might be they see as a threat to their rule, ultimately. A genuine threat. And so, but that's pretty interesting. I've read that Josephus tons of times, because it's just, I don't know, it's profound and heartbreaking. Like you said, it's a tragedy.
Yeah, for sure. So that's a really good and just summation of their view of Judaism as I said, monotheistic, but they saw as atheistic, which was interesting. But what about Christianity? Because that is, as we know, comes out of the Hebrew tradition. Yeah. So that's perfect, the way that you just kind of teed that up, because the way that the Romans saw it, and I think actually rightfully so, was that Christianity, at least at first, was not independent from Judaism. They simply saw it as a sect of Judaism, a specific group of Jewish people who were worshiping in a particular way. So as it stood under the law, where you were allowed to, we're kind of backing up a little bit before the sacking of Jerusalem, right? It's like in the days of like Caligula,
Claudius, like those type of emperors initially, you're allowed to worship as a Christian because the Jews were allowed to practice their faith as well.
Right.
And so as far as they're concerned, there's really not much difference.
Yeah.
Now, that obviously didn't include for Christians, they were facing persecution from Jewish officials. There's tension there, but in the case of Rome, they're basically for the first couple decades, probably 20 or 30 years that Christianity is growing after the death of Christ. Rome itself at the capital, because you have to remember, right, like Judea as a province is like the farthest corner of the Roman Empire. It's like the furthest outskirts geographically. And so within the empire itself, within the capital, there's really not much, like the emperor's not aware, like they're not super like in tune to this thing of Christianity. But
and this was, you said, about 30 years since what I believe to be the death and resurrection of Christ. It was about 30 years time period where they weren't aware that it even existed.
Yeah, it's like it would be, so maybe it's better to say it's a progressive growth of awareness in that 30 years.
Which makes sense because Christianity was growing.
It's spreading, right? We get in the gospel or in the New Testament accounts, right, this idea of like Paul the apostle taking this journey to Rome. Right. And so you kind of have this picture of like the first people going to spread Christianity in Rome is happening in that 30-year time period. Right. It's like it's happening slowly over time. And Christianity starts as this like super grassroots level.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's just people in their houses. Right. Like it's like normal people are the first people that it reaches. And that stays true throughout. I didn't have this in the outline, but that's one of the criticisms that that Rome has against Christianity is that it's like preying upon simple people and women.
Oh, wow.
Because they're going, these people are like preaching their gospel in, amongst workers and slaves and like, just like people that are living everyday life versus it's not reaching the tops of like the intellectual
Interesting
hierarchy in Rome. So that's just a fascinating side note.
Yeah.
However, we do get by around the time of Claudius, which he's a few emperors after. They believe that Jesus was probably crucified under Tiberius's reign, near the end of Tiberius's reign. Claudius is a couple after him. And we get this in Suetonius' Life of Claudius. He talks about how because the Jews were continually causing disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius expelled them from Rome.
Gotcha.
What we think this is one of the first instances where you have the emperor is hearing about this so-called group of Jews who are stirring up trouble at the instigation of a person, Chrestus.
Yeah.
Which is really fascinating. What that shows, just kind of on a historical level, is once again, it shows that they viewed Christians and Jews as the same, right? They thought it's like there's this group of Jews who are being told to do something by this person, Chrestus, or Christus, Christ. So it shows that they thought of them initially as one and the same. And secondly, it shows that, this is sort of the point where that influence of Christianity has spread all the way to Rome. That it's causing enough stir within the people that even the emperor knows about it now, which is really fascinating.
Yeah.
So, I have a little cough here, clear my throat. Now, unlike the initial tolerance that's afforded to Judaism to the animistic religions to a point, as we've discussed, once Christianity, its effects start to be felt by Rome, it doesn't take long before persecution, they begin to try to suppress the religion.
Makes
which
sense.
is one thing I'd say, not entirely, but to a point makes it a little bit unique, because I think, the treatment of Christianity, in a sense, is unique than some of these other religions.
Yeah.
Insofar as, persecution happens fairly quickly. So we talked about the case of Claudius, him expelling these Jews from Rome. Another one of the early instances of intense persecution is one of the most famous accounts. This is under the Emperor Nero. In 64 AD, there's a massive fire that spreads throughout Rome, burns down all of the wooden structures that are kind of existing in the older part of Rome. Fascinating today because Nero does rebuild that most of that part of the city, and then they do it with like the stone buildings that we see today.
Yeah.
It's like when you go, what you see, a lot of it is the like post Nero Rome.
Wow. Okay.
Which is just kind of random fun fact. But so the fire happens, burns down a large portion of the city. Nero ultimately blames the fire on the Christians' refusal to participate in public life, which in his mind angered the gods. That's another one of the largest criticisms of Christianity by the Roman kind of intelligentsia, Roman elites, things like that, is that Christians live a very private life. You know, they want to stay in their homes. They want to worship their God in private. They have their meetings to worship their God are in their homes in secret, those sorts of things. And this is considered very faux pas to the Romans because, as we've discussed, you know, their religion is a state religion. It's a public religion, right? There's public festivals that take place several times a year that are both state-sponsored, state-led, but also religious festivals.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So it's like you are expected, and then even just the act of worship, you go to a public temple. You know, you give a public sacrifice of, you know, like incense or whatever it is. You might give literal money, food, right? Like you're doing a public act. The people who work at the temple are public servants, right? So it's you're participating in the larger Roman society when you're doing that. The Christians aren't doing that.
Right.
In fact, there are certain things that they're saying that we want to abstain from. In their eyes, not to cause an issue, but just because it goes against we can't give a tribute to another god because that would go against worshiping our God.
Right.
So Nero blames that specific thing on the reason why the fire happened.
Wow. Okay.
And that causes mass persecution. So this is where we get kind of the images of, you know, sticking, you know, Christians on stakes and, you know, lighting them on fire to be like street lamps and throwing them into the gladiatorial games and all these sorts of things. Really, really intense persecution in Rome itself.
Yeah.
And we'll get back to another element of that in a second.
Okay.
But the most intense persecution of Christians comes much later. 284 AD is called the Great Persecution under the Emperor Diocletian. And which that's really fascinating because that's like 220 years later. And so you have kind of this expanse of time where you have intermittent persecution, right? Things will happen. Emperor will persecute Christians. They'll kind of settle down, kind of this back and forth. There's this really famous correspondence between Pliny the Elder. You've probably heard of this. It's literally the most like one of the most famous documents in world history.
Yeah.
Writing to the Emperor Trajan.
I think so.
Asking what to do about Christians. Trajan's response is like, don't seek them out, but if they cause an issue, deal with it as you see fit. So that's kind of generally the policy for the next like 200 years. Then under Diocletian, you have this mass persecution empire-wide where it outlaws Christianity, criminalizes Christians, and says, you know, the purpose of this is to restore traditional Roman values.
Right.
You know, it's to, like, in their eyes, we've been dealing with this thing of Christianity for a few hundred years now. It's the reason why everything's going to hell in a handbasket. We need to finally, like, deal with this problem.
Gotcha.
At head. So that's the general view, right? Is like, that's how they viewed Christians. They persecute him. Really fascinating thing about the instance of Nero is the historian Tacitus, who's the one who we get the story of Nero and the fire from, or at least one of the accounts from, discusses how Nero used the Christians as a scapegoat, right? He blames them. He says they are one that caused the fire. This is why it's happened. Tacitus talks about how even amongst the people, once they saw the persecution that happened to Christians, other Romans didn't really buy Nero's story, and they said that it was more likely just one guy enacting his cruelty.
Oh, wow.
Which, what we're going to talk about in a second, I think is fascinating because it shows this kind of idea that, like, while there might be this sort of top-down view on what's happening, what's actually happening on the ground level, right? The way that people are interacting with each other is different, as it often is.
Yeah. And that kind of brings me to like this next question. Like, in the midst of all this kind of persecution, I have a little bit of knowledge on that just from reading like the book of Acts in the Bible, but were Christians treated as Roman citizens? I mean, if they were citizens, but were they treated as that?
So, yeah, and that's, again, this kind of idea that, right, like there's nuance to the idea and the fact that, as we'll see, like on the ground levels, even amongst government officials, right, you are afforded certain rights as Roman citizen, regardless of what your faith is.
Okay.
At least as a rule.
Yeah.
Always and
exceptions.
So the main kind of right that they are given is this concept within Roman law of due process, right? This idea that there's actually a legal procedure that must happen before someone can be executed, imprisoned, all these sorts of things.
Okay.
Most famous example that you alluded to from the Bible is you have the Apostle Paul is a Roman citizen, and when he's in prison for what he's doing, appeals to that citizenship and uses that as his avenue to get an audience with the emperor.
Right.
We know that he goes there. We don't know if he ever actually spoke to an emperor, but that's the big example of like him using those legal recourses to his advantage. There's also another really famous one. It's a story I find extremely fascinating. This is later than the Apostle Paul, but this is called the Acts of St. Felix. Felix is a Christian bishop in the region of Carthage, funny enough.
Okay.
But they, when the Emperor Diocletian sends out his edict to essentially snuff out Christianity, one of the things that they do is they're looking for the Christian scriptures, which is actually mostly the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, plus some of the writings that they had, the Gospels and things that were circulating.
Right.
They are seeking those out to burn them and destroy them.
Wow. Okay.
To kind of snuff this thing out at the head, so to speak. So Felix, this bishop, he's brought before the local curator. He's asked to give up the Christian scriptures, and he refuses to do so. What's really fascinating about the story is that rather than just sort of then that guy being like, okay, I'm just going to like execute you on the spot because you said no. He tells him basically, okay, you know what will happen to you if you don't abide by the law. So he tells him, go home, take 3 days, think about your decision, come back and discuss it again. Really interesting because it's like he, if it was just the instance of like insane anarchy, martial law, he could have just done whatever he pleased in that moment.
Right.
But instead, he follows this process of, no, I'm going to ask you multiple times. If you continue to deny, I'll give you 3 days. You come back. Felix doesn't change his decision. So then the curator brings Felix before a proconsul. He goes through the same process. He asks him multiple times, are you willing to give up the scriptures? He says no. And then, only then, is he executed.
Wow.
So, obviously, you can look at it from the stance of not really religious toleration, right? Because
it's not, especially under Diocletian.
Yeah.
Right.
But it shows this willingness, at least in part, on Romans, this rule of law, right? And this idea that like there is a procedure, there are ways that if you're a Roman citizen, you're afforded certain rights under the law, that you will be treated in a certain manner,
right?
Regardless of, this sort of religious aspect, which is, I think, it's a very important component when trying to understand how the Romans treated people of different religious groups, right? Like they have certain rights under the law.
Yeah. So that's really fascinating, and I appreciate that. I didn't know that about Felix. But all this that we've talked about so far, it's you talked about Rome's religion. You talked how they viewed other religions, and specifically we got into some of the Eastern religions, but then we got into Judaism and Christianity and how they viewed that, and I appreciate that. So just the little bit I know about the timeline of history, was Christianity made the official Roman religion under the Emperor Constantine?
So, no. Which is sort of, I think, the big misconception is that Constantine, when he becomes emperor in 304, he makes Christianity the state religion. It just is for Rome.
Right.
What actually happened is in 313 AD is when the Edict of Milan is passed.
Okay.
That's generally what's seen as that legislation that would happen. All the Edict of Milan actually does is it decriminalizes the practicing of Christianity.
Okay.
So it puts us in this official status of like recognized religions as it's like acceptable to practice it,
Gotcha.
which is different. It's not until later under Emperor Theodosius where Christianity is codified into the Roman law code.
Interesting.
There's actually a written law code produced by Theodosius, and in it has all these specifics about how Christians are supposed to be treated, and it sort of gives them preferential status.
Wow.
That's where a lot of historians have said, like, no, that's actually when it becomes the official state religion, because it takes this sort of higher status than other religions within the empire.
And then eventually they do away with the pantheon and all that.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay. Interesting. Well, cool.
So yeah, not sure how long we've been talking. Probably longer than I planned.
It's okay. It's been fascinating. I appreciate it.
That's usually how it goes.
Yeah.
Joel, again, I appreciate you being here. Appreciate you chatting with me, talking about this stuff. But just to kind of conclude on everything we talked about, going back to our quote from Burbank and Cooper that kind of gave us this parameter look at these things. I'm going to read the quote again just for repetition's sake.
Yeah.
It says, empires are large political units, expansionist or with a memory of power extended over space, polities that maintain distinction and hierarchy as they incorporate new people. The empire reaches outward and draws, usually coercively, peoples whose difference is made explicit under its rule. The concept of empire presumes that different peoples within the polity will be governed differently. So based on what we've discussed in this podcast, I believe it's obvious that definition of empire does apply to the Romans' treatments, specifically of religious groups. They're integrating different people groups and religion and ethnicity, right? Like ethnic groups and things like that. Sometimes they're one and the same, sometimes they're different. It just depends on the case. But the fact of the matter is that it's clear that they were willing to treat those groups in a hierarchy of who gets supremacy, right? The animistic Roman religion, like that's obviously the most supreme, and then kind of goes down from there. Some are afforded more rights than others, in the example of, say, Judaism. But at the end of the day, there's sort of this, while they're willing to oftentimes pray to or tolerate, a wide variety of different gods, different religions, they're also, entirely unopposed to legislatively or violently suppressing religions,
right,
if they so deem them a threat to either their rule, or the big one, I think, really is if they break this kind of conventional Roman idea of cultural norms, cultural duty. There's a big thing called pietas in Roman society, which is your duty to your people, who you're supposed to be as a Roman, right? And yeah, so, they believed, it's clear that they believed themselves to be justified in the way that they treated different religious groups based upon whatever merit they deemed necessary. And I think that just kind of falls in line with that idea of empire laid out in Burbank and Cooper. And really, I think it's a helpful way to kind of look at this idea of, Roman Empire, how they dealt with religious groups and things like that.
Yeah.
So, but that's it, man. That's all I got. Again, thanks, Joel, for being on this with me. Thanks for using your equipment. And
thanks to the guys who let us use it. But I thank you for this, because it was fascinating. I learned so much I didn't know, and especially just about like how their own religion worked versus how they would incorporate and then rule over, give the okay or not okay to the other religions. And when they started getting out of line with their Pax Romana or their Pietas or whatever, they usually clamp down pretty hard.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. So yeah,
exactly.
I appreciate it.
Good deal. Well, thanks again. And this was fun.
Yeah. Thanks, buddy.